Hey everyone, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching platform. I'm back with Dr. Jonathan Cook as we talk about John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Really excited about this. This is probably the final interview we'll have before going public with the platform, and I'm really excited for everyone to go over and beta test it over at noetic.online, and we'll have the new version of the app available in about 2 weeks. And we're going to do a slow rollout over the summer, and hopefully this thing will catch fire by the fall and become part of the teaching landscape. And Dr. Jonathan Cook has been a big part of that, bringing his expertise and knowledge to many of these texts. We were talking off air just a little bit ago, and I thought we should preserve it for posterity's sake. Dr. Cook had asked me what I thought about John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and I was telling him I felt very complicated about it. I had very complicated feelings about it, but I felt then a little bit legitimated as I went into the secondary sources and noted that many people had divergent reactions to this text. This is my second time reading it since I was a senior in high school. So it's been about 20 years since I touched it last. And as the fact that I'm torn in different directions about the text doesn't mean that I don't think it was a worthwhile thing, because it's certainly been really provocative and it's opened up a lot of really big issues for me. So maybe I'll share some of that in a second, but Dr. Cook, maybe you could tell us why you chose this text.
I think that it's important to read The Grapes of Wrath because it's a classic of 20th century American literature, and it tells you a lot about the history of the Great Depression, and it kind of encapsulates a major theme of American history is the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. I mean, the country was founded on the principle of political liberty and social equality, and we have ended up in our history with several situations where the inequality has led to major social conflicts, so that it sort of illustrates a recurring theme in American history of, the powerless versus the powers that be. And I like to think of it as one of a trilogy of important books with a social message in American literature. Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle, and Grapes of Wrath. Each of them is considered to be an important literary work. I don't know if you call them masterpieces. I mean, in some respects they are. All of them sold well. All of them had a big impact on their readership. Beginning with Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was absolutely vital to the crystallization of anti-slavery sentiment in the North, leading to the Civil War, and sold, millions of copies. So it had a huge impact on American history in the 1850s. The Jungle also had a big impact in terms of exposing the faults in the American meatpacking industry in the early 20th century, and also showing the oppression of immigrant laborers in the meatpacking industry. And that directly led to changes in laws of inspections of food. The Food and Drug Administration came into effect partly as a result of Upton Sinclair's novel. And following that, Grapes of Wrath, it didn't lead to legislation, but it was a bestseller, and it revealed another situation of the oppression of workers by, in this case, a sort of impersonal economic machine of banks and big agriculture, throwing people off the land and pushing them down to subsistence level living. So in terms of the three, Grapes of Wrath probably had the least direct impact on means to change the situation to improve the lot of the immigrants, because basically in 1939, when the book was published, we were on the brink of World War II, and it was the entry into the war that pulled the country out of the Depression. It wasn't any changes in the laws of foreclosures and banking and agriculture. But anyway, those three books I think are really important for anyone's education in the social novel in America, and they're all great stories as well. I mean, everyone knows about the Joad family partly because of the movie, John Ford's movie from I guess it was 1940.
Well, yeah, that's apparently John Steinbeck made a pretty penny off that. I think he was paid $75,000 to sell the rights for that movie. I didn't get a chance to watch it, but I did see a number of clips, and it looks quite good. Do you like the movie?
Yeah, it's considered to be a pretty good adaptation of the film. Pretty truthful in terms of sticking to the storyline, Steinbeck's storyline.
You know what else I like about the associated media with this text is Woody Guthrie and how much the book inspired the folk songs of Woody Guthrie. I sort of learned about Woody Guthrie in a backwards fashion. And when I was a musician, one of my favorite bands in my early 20s was Wilco, and they partnered with Billy Bragg, who's kind of a working man songwriter, and I believe they got the go-ahead from Woody Guthrie's daughter to make a couple albums about unreleased Woody Guthrie songs. And I think, so seeing the tie-ins with the Grapes of Wrath and figuring out who this Tom Joad character was really exciting for me. It got to tie in my music past with this novel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the novel has had quite a big impact on popular culture, particularly music. And, I love Woody Guthrie, and I admire his career, and I like Bruce Springsteen, and the whole album he made in 1995 of Guthrie songs is great. So so there's continuing impact in the musical world.
I love that when you can kind of find your own adventure and trace it back to the source. You get excited by an alt country band, and all of a sudden you're reading Grapes of Wrath, or you're into Bob Dylan, and then you're reading Grapes of Wrath, or go further back. And I'm really excited, like you mentioned earlier, to complete the trilogy of social novels. I've never read Upton Sinclair. I've only read about the jungle and like history books and the impact that it had. So I hope we cover that at some point in the near future. Yeah. I'm trying to think about some of the things that were complicated about this text for me. I think stylistically it was a little hard for me because I knew Steinbeck was holding back, but I also, it's a very plain spoken novel. It's written for the common man to understand it. But at the same time, John Steinbeck is a man of tremendous intellect and genius. And I guess I'm a little bit of an overtop personality myself. I kind of wanted to see him indulge in that a little bit more, but the book is so remarkably restrained in that respect. And I see the virtue in that. I see the virtue in it being simple and direct and capturing those moments. But at times I was waiting for some of the prose that, we've encountered with Melville and Hawthorne in other episodes. So stylistically, I had a bit of a struggle with it. What do you think about that?
Well, I think he successfully captured the dialect of his working class characters. I mean, a lot of the original settlers from in California were Midwesterners starting from the 19th century. So he grew up in Salinas, surrounded by Protestants, some of whom were lower class, who spoke kind of like the Joads. I mean, of course, there were a lot of other ethnicities around, mainly Hispanic and Asian. But he labored very carefully over the book. He spent, I think, a couple of years at least. He, didn't want his editor to change anything because he claimed that he spent hours and hours carefully crafting this book. And if you look at the language, though, I mean, some of the simplicity is not just of the speakers, but it's reflects a sort of biblical plain-spokenness that we should explore more, because this book is absolutely steeped in the Bible, and a lot of the sort of deliberative language, the kind of stuff you find in Hemingway, for instance, the slow cadence and the sort of earthiness of the speech. A lot of it has to do with sort of emulating some biblical stylistics.
And it's not just the language; it's the themes. I mean, you
Yeah.
can clearly see that there are parallels to the Book of Exodus, right?
Yeah.
With the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and in a same we're encountering a group of migratory individuals that are
Yeah.
have been disrupted and are going out and living on faith of a better life.
Yeah, I mean the large myth is the Exodus myth, but there's lots of different layers to it, and
Sure.
there are other it's sort of a simultaneous mix of New Testament and Old Testament together, constant interplay between the two halves of the Bible.
This was a departure from our last discussion, which was about Stowe's Uncle
Yeah.
Tom's Cabin, where in Uncle Tom's Cabin, I loved Uncle Tom's Cabin because, to be honest, and I don't really, I think it's okay for me to show my cards here. Uncle Tom's Cabin made me very proud to be a Christian, because I felt like it captured the purity of the Christian message. I think maybe part of the reasons why I felt complicated, I had complicated feelings about the Grapes of Wrath, is how it seems like Steinbeck did want to divorce the ontological religious foundations of the Bible from the language. Still want to use the themes and the language, but not really the concepts of the Christian God. It almost seems like he's playing more with the character, the kind of the former preacher.
I mean,
It seems like
Jim Casey.
Yeah, Casey. It's almost like he's got this sort of Eastern oversoul, pantheistic sort of view where he sees everything as being part of God. He seems to be getting away from Christian concepts of God. So I think that was one of my sort of frustrations, but I also understand its importance to hold on to those myths and those language, but at the same time introduce Eastern traditions.
Yeah. Well, he's he's creating a secularized Christianity that pretty much uses all the symbolism of the Bible to send a message of a religion of humanity,
Right.
because he's getting away from any ideas of original sin. Any kind of dogmatic Christianity is out the window, but what you end up with is the message of Christ as the prophet of love and equality and charity towards all. So the humanistic message of the book relies on the Christian framework, and the Old Testament framework is there to sort of present a larger sort of epic vision of American history, and to also reinforce the message that there is a punitive God out there who is angry when people mistreat each other. So just as in Uncle Tom's Cabin, we have a beautiful message of Uncle Tom as the perfect Christian who's going to die for his faith and not hold a grudge against anyone. But behind the scenes of Stowe's novel is the threat of a Christian God who's going to punish those who sanction the injustice of slavery and allow more and more Uncle Toms to die as a result of their beatings and whippings and whatever. So it's kind of the same dynamic at work. There's a social message of love and charity that promotes the Christian message, but behind the scenes is the Old Testament God who is there going to punish the evildoers and those who don't
So
honor his
so would you
message.
say, so would you say the Old Testament God in this text maybe takes the form of the state or the banks, and the New Testament message is more exhibited by the lowly folks that are helping each other along the way?
Well, no, I mean the Old Testament message is that these banks and collectives of agribusiness and banks are the oppressors. They're the pharaohs
Right.
of kicking people out of Oklahoma are the banks without any kind of direct sense of responsibility. They're owned by a bunch of Wall Street types. So, I mean, this is a classic episode in American history that is true today as it was back then. That
Oh, yes, it
the
is.
impersonal. I mean, you could look at the 2008 crash as a result of the same thing, the depersonalization of the banking system, so that all these mortgages get packaged together and then sliced into what are called tranches, and sold to investors around the world. And the distance between the homeowner and the investor, who doesn't give a damn about who's living in the home but just wants to make money, that dynamic means that the whole system is rigged against the person who runs into problems, the homeowner, the landlord, or whatever. So, I mean, the biblical basis for the early section of the book is that Pharaoh is the banks, and the plagues of Egypt are the droughts
Ah,
and dust storms that are not tied up, of course, to the banking industry, but they're the plagues that are punishing the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers, and are forcing them out. So anytime you have the biblical symbolism, it doesn't match up totally with the
analogies break down.
overarching narrative. It just uses things for here and there for its own purposes, with
Right.
sort of some of the larger themes overlapping. Um, but it's really fascinating how close you can trace these themes in the book. For instance, when the Jodes are getting ready to leave the night before their departure from the Uncle John's farm, because they've had to abandon their own homestead. They go out and slaughter the pigs and have this, one last meal because they can't take the pigs with them. And if you look at some of the language of this scene, it's clearly that this is sort of the Passover dinner, and they're not eating lamb, of course, which is what they do in the Old Testament, but there's some interesting references to blood. I mean, they're not smearing it on the doorpost, but the bloody scene of slaughter is comparable. But on the other hand, they're eating pigs,
Yeah.
which is the forbidden animal in the Old Testament. They're not eating the lamb,
Right.
so
It's a
it's a
highly
Passover
symbolic.
with
Yeah.
pigs.
Yeah. It's a highly symbolic organism in the New Testament as well, because like right
Right.
when Jesus cast the legion of demons out of the
Yeah.
man, they cast them into the swine,
The
right?
swine. Yeah.
Yeah, they go plunging off the cliff. One of the other things that's connected to all this that I had complicated feelings about was was the this conglomerate of agribusiness was left in an abstraction, and
Yeah.
our characters are, they're left wondering. They're like, well, why do we lose our land? Well, why do we have to get off here? Why do we have to go here? Why? And the answer is always like, you know, they kick it to some local office, and then it goes back to New York. And then at some point, the questions cease to be about who is driving this monstrosity that are the banks. And there aren't assignable individuals that could maybe be accountable for dispossessing all these people and making their lives so terrible. It's just kind of left
Well,
as this like fictitious entity. And I don't know. I mean, someone's got to, someone's, was someone's got to have some accountability somewhere for this, right?
Yeah.
The buck has to stop somewhere, right? Like, what is it, the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve or something, or FDR? I don't know.
Yeah, well, you're hearing the story from the point of view of the dispossessed. So the banks are impersonal because that's the way it felt to be a dispossessed person.
Right.
Although the agent of the banks, like the guy driving the tractor who's pushing over the
Right.
houses, in that one chapter, Joe Davis, I mean, he's recognized as someone they know from the community, and he's only doing it just because he got paid $3 an hour,
Right.
and he wouldn't be able to support his family without that. But so
I feel like it would have been an opportunity for Steinbeck to propose a solution to this rather than leading. Well, it's just this great monstrosity that
yeah.
has gotten out of control.
Well, I think he's just like Stowe. He's looking for a change of heart. I mean, he can't. Upton Sinclair in his Jungle. I mean, he changed legislation, and that was great. But I think Steinbeck is there for to teach people how to treat other people with dignity and to make them sympathetic to the underdog. I mean, as a message to as a literary text, that's about all you can do. I mean, literature is not meant to change history; it only does it by accident. But it just teaches people some basic respect and humanity, and I think that's all he was trying to do.
Well, it's unfortunate because I think if he had presented some positive solutions in that respect, and I don't know how you would do it through these characters, but because he didn't, the question's left dangling about whether or not Steinbeck was a communist, right? And that's what about a bunch of this controversy is about, is that from my understanding of the secondary sources, is that there was a great uproar at the time that this might actually have been communist propaganda to incite revolution within America. Now, and I didn't read it that way, but
well, that's
apparently
the way
that was in the atmosphere.
His enemies. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it was Kern County where a lot of the scenes at the peach orchard, where Jim Casey is killed. This is just around Bakersfield in the Central Valley of California. Well, Kern County, they banned the book, from their public library for 2 years, and there was some negative reaction also in Oklahoma. But I think it was only the people who felt were under attack who really came out strong against Steinbeck. I mean, I don't think anyone believed he was a communist. His previous book, In Dubious Battle, has a protagonist who's a labor organizer who's made to seem kind of like a bad guy, manipulative, and so he was not known in his previous fiction as being any kind of secret communist. Unlike a lot of other writers at the time, I think he definitely thought of himself as something as a socialist. But
what's so ironic about all this is he's exonerated from the communist charge, because didn't he become kind of a mouthpiece for LBJ in the Vietnam War? What a weird twist of fate that he could be on this issue in defense of the worker, right? And then he's kind of part of this national campaign to get people excited about Vietnam. I mean,
I think the more he found out about Vietnam, the more skeptical he became.
I agree.
But no, I mean, he kept up his social criticism. I mean, The Winter of Our Discontent is a scathing depiction of this hollow materialism of Eisenhower's America, the late 50s. Travels with Charlie, his nonfiction book about driving around the country, also has some pretty hard-hitting passages about the civil, what's going on with civil rights and and other things. So I think he had a sort of a bromance with Johnson, but I
Yeah.
don't think it seriously compromised his integrity though, because he was his own man throughout his life. He didn't have any radical change in his viewpoint.
Well,
Like
it's
John Dos Passos, someone like that, who went from far left to far right.
and it's fair. I mean, hindsight's always 2020. I mean, I think early on in the Vietnam conflict, I mean, things were very different than what they
Yeah,
turned out to be in the early 70s. So, I mean, it's very easy to criticize people when you have the benefit of hindsight.
yeah,
Well, all right. So those were some of my major concerns, and I know I've eaten up a lot of time. Although I do appreciate the back and forth on this, I think it's been really helpful for me to get my head around it and to comprehend it. And hopefully other people have enjoyed this as well. But maybe we should go back to some sort of basic questions, like what's the genesis story of this
yeah.
text? Maybe we can have a little bit more background about how it came to be.
Yeah, so Steinbeck published In Dubious Battle about struggles between labor and capital in the agricultural industry in California, and after that, in 1936 that book came out, and then he was commissioned to write some articles about the migrant laborers for the San Francisco News. So he became a working journalist for a while, and he published these articles under the titles of gypsy laborers. These migrant workers who were, a lot of them from the Midwest, from Oklahoma and Arkansas and North Texas. So he had a lot of personal contact with these people. He also interviewed and lived at the Weed Patch Camp in Arvin, just south of Bakersfield, which is featured in the novel. And so a lot of his description of the Jodes in the Weed Patch Camp are based on his intimate knowledge. In fact, the director of the camp, Jim Rawley, it was partly based on the person who was running the Weed Patch Camp, which was part of the built by the Works Progress Administration. It was a federal camp to help the laborers at the time, have a more dignified place to live than these Hoovervilles, which they spontaneously put up. So anyway, he spent this time writing these articles, and then he sat down and wrote this book very carefully. It took about two or 3 years, published in April 1939, and the book really struck a chord with its audience, and over the next year it sold, I think, 430,000 copies through the first 10 months or so, and has since been a bestseller pretty steadily since its original publication. So it's considered Steinbeck's best book, and it is more or less accurate in its depiction of the lives of these migrant laborers. I mean, he was faulted for his description of the landscape in Oklahoma where these people came from. He placed them in Sallisaw, which is a sort of more rolling hills and a greener part of Oklahoma, and not as affected by these huge dust storms in the more arid part of western Oklahoma. So anyway, he did not visit Oklahoma to research the book, but he listened to stories of many people who came from there. So it's not faulted in most of its realism.
Do you think those? Do you think he had an adequate grasp enough, given his association with those stories?
Yeah, I mean, he talked to many of these so-called Okies, right? And he knew that world from growing up in the Salinas Valley. So it was in his blood to talk to people working on the land and to understand the dynamics of these big agribusinesses who needed workers for just a few weeks at a time. So he really knew the business well. He was a very practical minded man. He read a lot in different areas, and he knew a lot about machines. And for instance,
Right.
if you read about the fixing that car of the Wilsons, it's a very detailed description about
I love that
placing
scene.
a cam, and it really makes you want to get out and roll up your sleeves and look at under the hood of your car. Of course, it's a completely different kind of setup now. Everything's a mini computer, but it's fun to read his practical descriptions of cars and trucks, because he really had a mastery of that world as well.
That's such a great scene. I love that scene because there's like great irony in it. I was telling my father about that scene because, he grew up in an era. He was one of those teenagers that are described in that scene that could just leap into a car and immediately tear it apart and put it back together again.
Yeah.
And then that skill set was lost on my generation. Like, none of us know how to work on cars. It's not natural, but like my generation and younger, all of us know how to tear up, like do computers. Yeah.
Right.
And so like the computer is kind of like, this intuitive understanding of the computer is what the intuitive understanding of the car was for that generation. And I wonder what will be the thing that comes next, because the way he's describing the teenagers taking apart the car, it's like they're Neo in the Matrix, and he can't even fathom how it's occurring. And I thought the same thing happens to Gen X and millennial people. They're just like if you do like the most simple tasks on the computer, your parents are like, wow, like you're going to be a millionaire programmer because you set up a computer in 15 minutes. I also thought was very interesting. I've actually been to Salinas, and I stopped.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah. I stopped in Salinas while I was driving down or up California. I can't remember which direction I was going at that time. I stopped into a gym. And then we should talk about this, the interstate that's involved in this story, Route 66 and the significance of Route 66. We should talk about that from a religious perspective too. But I stopped into this gym in Salinas, and I had no idea where I was. And I was like, where am I? Like, I was just trying to get a quick workout in. And the receptionist was like, Salinas. And I was like, well, what's Salinas known for? And she's like, violence. And I was like, oh God, this was the most terrifying workout of my life. But I just think because I went into this gym and I felt like, these are some pretty tough characters in here. But it's kind of a shame that people don't. I mean, maybe I was in the dark about this, but I don't know if people automatically associate Steinbeck with Salinas. It would have been a better way to sell me on Salinas than violence if she just told me John Steinbeck wrote about this place and was from here.
Well, he lived later on in Monterey, and I think Monterey has a more visible public recognition of Steinbeck. They named his Cannery Row Street, I think, and a lot of places are commemorating his. Where he worked and lived, just the same way they do it for Hemingway or something like that. So Monterey is the place to go for more, Steinbeck memorials.
I'll have to make another trip out there just to go on a Steinbeck pilgrimage.
Yeah.
But I guess he also spent time on the East Coast too, didn't he? Wasn't he in New York at some point?
Well, yeah, he went to New York as a young man to try to be a writer after he dropped out of Stanford. In the 20s, I guess it was the sort of the mid 20s, and then he ended up back in California. But then he moved to New York, and ended up on Long Island, for the last 20 or so years of his life, but his roots are really in California.
Yeah,
So,
I think he's ultimately buried out there, isn't he?
I don't
I
know
think
exactly, to tell you the
I think
truth.
so. I
Yeah,
think so. I'll have to look. I'll look into that while you're answering the next question. So we were talking earlier about social programs in the novel and stuff like that.
yeah.
Do you think it was forced here? Do you think it detracts from the novel that he might have had a
No, I
social
mean,
angle?
as I said earlier, I mean, I think it's one of the three great books in American literature that incorporates a compelling narrative with a social message. You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle, and Grapes of Wrath, because the Joad family is an incredibly vibrant and vivid presence, and I mean, they're kind of a mythological family at this point, because each of them is, has such a distinct kind of personality, and they form this group of sort of archetypal examples of the dispossessed. And the other thing is, they represent. There are 12 of them, right? So they're kind of, when they get in their car driving their Hudson Super 6, they're driving along as sort of Jim Casey as the Jesus figure, and the 12 disciples who were
Right.
the family, taking off before they start dropping out. But that's it's not just Jesus and the disciples, but it's also the 12 tribes of Israel who were
Right.
migrating out of the oppressive land of Egypt with its plagues to the promised land of Canaan or California. So,
I just looked it up. John Steinbeck he was in fact buried in Salinas, a place called Garden of Memories.
uh-huh.
And he was 66 years old.
Yeah, yeah. He died of
Interesting.
heart failure. He had progressive heart disease. So he knew. I think he knew he was going to die in the early '60s. Then died in 1968. And I think he did a fair amount of drinking, so he probably didn't help himself with that.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
I was listening to a documentary on him, and like every story was like, and we were having a bottle of wine that night. And
yeah,
then John said, I'm like, pretty much every story I'm hearing about John Steinbeck involved a bottle of wine or something here. I'm like,
yeah.
you
Well, he
know,
lived longer than Hemingway and Fitzgerald, so
no.
he.
If anyone wants to see his grave, you can actually go to the totally not macabre website findagrave.com, and you can look at his tomb.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah,
that's kind of an awesome
it's
thing.
his
I actually kinda
it's
like
his
that.
ashes. His ashes. He was cremated,
Oh, okay.
so it's not. Anyway,
Anyway, yeah, interesting stuff. So,
well, let's talk a
what?
little more about the religious
Yeah, sure.
side. So the book is really logically structured into it's 30 chapters. The first 10 chapters or so are the the plagues of Egypt, the drought conditions, and then you have these fascinating interchapters which happen every so often that sort of step back and describe some scenes that are going on that are related to what the family is doing. You have the description of the drought. You have the description of what it's like to buy a used car from a very seasoned used car salesman. You have a scene on Route 66 of Alan May's diner where we have a little parable of May being the Good Samaritan by giving the migrant's child some free candy. So all of these are, I think the best description would be that these are sort of choral interludes, broadening the picture of what's going on with the Joads, and they underline the social message of the book, especially the one that reiterates the importance of the title, the Grapes of Wrath, and that chapter is in California, and it describes the waste of agriculture. Because the prices have dropped and they're destroying fruit or pumping poisons into it or putting it in the the rivers because the sellers don't want to sell it. The price is too low. So the waste of food like that elicits Steinbeck's Old Testament voice, like this is terrible thing to be doing when people are hungry and starving. In America, you're destroying food because of this economic system that has sort of pulled the rug out from under the price. Anyway, to get back to the sort of biblical framework, what I find fascinating is just how rich and detailed it is without being that obvious. Because a lot of the description of the drought and these huge dust storms mimic the language of the first chapter of Genesis, but it's almost like the uncreation of the earth. It's not God separating the land from the sky. It's God, the forces of weather mixing the land and the sky together to create these huge dust clouds. So Steinbeck mimics the language of Genesis in the first chapter of the description of the dust storms, and the description of Jim Casey as a Christ figure and Tom Joad as sort of his early disciple are quite fascinating in terms of their mimicry. And Jim Casey, of course, he says the grace at the meal of the Joads in language that directly mimics language of Christ, and he's says a prayer from Psalms when they bury the grandfather on the road, and of course when he's killed by the guys who were the vigilantes who were breaking the strike at the peach orchard, he says, you don't know what you're doing, when the guy comes up to him with his axe handle and pounds him over the head, right? So it's all this description of Christ's, telling, his plea on the cross was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And also Tom Joad's immediate attack against the guy who smashed the head is like Peter in the garden when Jesus is arrested and cutting off the ear of the soldier, Right. And then the family making themselves scarce after Tom's likely murder of the guy who was killing Casey is typified in the flight of Peter from the disappearance of all the disciples after Jesus' arrest. Although in this case, it's just because Tom doesn't, want to be arrested for murder and sent back to McAllister and, facing more legal nightmares. So the biblical parallels are quite detailed, quite intricate, not obvious at first. For instance, grandfather Joad, when they have to drug him to put him in the truck, when they're leaving, there's some parallels between that and Lot's flight from Sodom and Gomorrah, and the fact that he has to be duped. There's in the history of Lot, his daughters have to make they fool him by they make him sleep with them through duplicity. Which is not exactly what's happening to Grandpa Joad, but an interesting parallel of how, convincing some old guy to do something he doesn't want to do while they're fleeing some sinful city. And of course, Grandma Joad, dies later just like Lot's wife dies looking back to Sodom and Gomorrah. So the other parallel you find is there's Muley Graves, who is the early character that Tom and Jim Casey discover, kind of prowling around the Joad property. Is some of his language is based on Jeremiah's laments and trying to decide whether to leave or go with the exiles to Babylon, right? Because it's based on Jeremiah is based on the fall of Jerusalem in 586. The prophet is talking about the people who are leaving Jerusalem to go to Babylon, who were forced into exile, versus those who were trying to stay loyal and stay in the city. Of course, most of the upper classes and tradespeople were forced out of Jerusalem, but I guess a bunch of lower class people were allowed to stay behind. So anyway, you get this layering of the idea of exile is not just applicable to the Exodus story and the flight from Egypt, but you also have this layering of the flight from Sodom and Gomorrah of this righteous man Lot, and the flight from Jerusalem in 586. We shouldn't let the Exodus archetype, hide all these other interesting little biblical intricacies behind the storyline. And of course, all of this is, there's a pretty substantial scholarly literature on the biblical background to the book, and probably the most dominant strain of criticism is tied into this theme of the influence of the Bible on the book.
This is so fascinating to me, and you're really bringing out a lot of nuances that I missed. And now, because you're such a gifted educator, I'm like, aha! Like I'm having all these eureka moments as you're rattling them off. I'm like, of course. Why didn't I see that earlier?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that kind of comes to my mind, and we should probably talk about this relationship that Steinbeck had. And I don't know if you know much about this particular aspect of things, but he's writing this book that is obviously parasitic on so many allegories and myths and stories from the Bible.
Yeah.
But yet, I've seen you can go on YouTube and you can watch John Steinbeck do his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I highly recommend that everybody does it. Have you seen it?
No.
No, it's really great. I mean, I can't believe something like that's preserved. But it's a very secular acceptance speech. And I just have to wonder, how did this man who was so versed in the Bible, so fascinated with weaving it into his text, abandon all the conceptual foundations? And you're like, Luke, this is obvious. Any thinking person will do this. I wonder how much that influence with the biologist and philosopher Ed Ricketts had. Do you know anything about Ed Ricketts? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, he was his best friend, and they collaborated on a book about going to the Sea of Cortez.
That's right.
Importance of, the life of the community, not just the species. So, I think Steinbeck, he read the Bible as a kid. He went to Sunday school. He grew up in the Episcopalian Church, which is not exactly the most dogmatic Protestant denomination. They're sort of 1 foot in the Unitarian camp there. So I think, like a lot of writers, he was reading the Old Testament, the New Testament, for the incredible wealth of its stories and characters and the importance it's played in Western culture. So I think he's just recognizing, like anyone, like say Thomas Mann, who wrote 4 books about the Old Testament. Joseph and his brothers, deeply rooted in the Bible history, but he did so because it was such a great story. Thomas Mann was not a traditional religious person, but he was just grabbing onto the big ideas in the culture, and of course the Bible has always had a huge influence on American culture and American thinking, American people, and the Joads, of course, would have been Bible readers, and And so the whole world he's describing is very much rooted in the world of the Bible. But as an artist, he didn't want to be tied into any kind of dogmatic sense of trying to authenticate, the Bible message apart from the idea that human beings need to cooperate with each other to live lives that are dedicated to the principle of justice. So I think because he was writing a sort of on a big theme, he was reaching into the sort of deep mythos of American culture, which of course is based on the Bible.
Well, maybe one day you and I'll cover Sea of Cortez so we can get a better understanding of who this Ed Ricketts character was and exactly what poison he was putting in Steinbeck's mind.
Yeah,
or medicine.
He was a very charismatic guy, and Steinbeck was absolutely shattered when he died in 1948. And his car was run over by a train, and Steinbeck tried to see him. I guess he was on the East Coast and just got there right after he died. So he was shattered by this death of this man.
Yeah, so. It was obviously a very influential figure on his life. Well, something we should talk about is probably one of the most controversial scenes is really the ending, right? When Rosa Sharon offers her breast to a starving man, and to me, I mean, it's 2018. Okay, it's not 1939 when this text came out. Like, I didn't find it controversial, but apparently, it made people lose their minds.
Yeah,
why couldn't people understand? Like, this was an act of desperation and generosity and charity. Why people? This is about survival. Why would this cause such an uproar to thinking adults?
Yeah, well, it's especially ironic because Steinbeck did not originate the idea of a young woman helping an older man survive starvation, because it dates back to Roman history. There's Valerius Maximus wrote an incident of a young Roman woman saving her father from starvation. The story is her name is Pero, and the father's name is Cimon, and this was actually turned into a favorite theme of a lot of Renaissance and Baroque painters. So you have Rubens painting this scene, and it's called Roman Charity. It's a motif of a young woman nursing an older man, and in the original story, her father. But you have a dozen artists painting this scene, including Rembrandt Peale in 1811 painted a version of this. So there was a long tradition of young women saving old men from starvation by breastfeeding them, and of course most readers didn't know about it. I'm not sure where Steinbeck picked up the idea. If he knew the art.
Arguably, there's even more perverse episodes of survivals where like Romulus and Remus survived off the tit of a wolf. Right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, there we've got borderline bestiality, but no one's losing their mind about that.
Yeah. Well, there's also a passage in the Song of Songs. Of course, Rose of Sharon, her name is from the Song of Songs in the Old Testament, and there is an allusion to the idea of of course, the Song of Songs was read as a Christian allegory of love of Christ, so that there's an allusion to feeding the believer, breastfeeding the believer, and the idea is, she, in the book, she sort of is standing in as another Christ figure who's feeding the hungry there, in a sort of Christian motif. But the fascinating thing, though, is at the end of the book, it comes right after a recurrence of the biblical flood, when the family is living in the boxcar, which is kind of a little ark that eventually floods. I mean, it's a kind of ironic because they have to escape the boxcar no matter how much they don't want to, and their car is flooded, so that the book begins with a biblical plague of dust storms, and now it's ending with another biblical disaster of flooding. And it's ironic because the figure of Noah has abandoned the family much earlier. He left because he got attached to this river where they were camping out, just as they were getting to California. And so Noah is attached to this body of water instead of floating in the ark of continuing in the ark of the Hudson Super 6. He gets out and leaves the family. So there's no Noah in the family when the flood takes place. And then, of course, when Rose of Sharon has her stillborn baby, Uncle John takes him and puts him in a box and floats him down the river, just like Moses was put in a basket. And of course, this is a dead baby; it's not a live baby. But it sets up the end of the book, which is that after this disaster, there's kind of a new covenant with the survivors, so that if you look at the language of the end of the book of Rose of Sharon breastfeeding the man, there's sort of a hint that this is sort of an apocalyptic new world will emerge from this devastation of flooding. Of course, the odds seem against the family at this point because they don't have any money, they don't have any food, they're on foot at this point, their car has been flooded. So the odds of their survival seem slim, but we are seeing, this miraculous scene at the end of Rose of Sharon feeding this old man, kind of hints at human survival by unorthodox means, whatever that will be, because, Steinbeck didn't want to end the novel with the family all, dying off, and he just wanted to hint that, the future could be created with, Tom Joad, of course, becoming a labor organizer and the family somehow surviving. So he didn't want to. It was a hard book to end because you don't want to make it too dark and you don't want to make it too rosy. So you kind of end up with a compromise between the two.
Yeah. It's maybe I didn't find it that controversial because I've grown up in an era of reality TV where people on TV do all sorts of crazy survivalist stunts.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Well, who are the people who were inciting most of the outrage? Was it people who were even really seriously reading the book, or was it like?
I think it was mainly
like PTA
women.
moms?
I think it was the female reader who were uncomfortable with that idea.
Oh, okay.
As though it's kind of pornographic or something. I don't know.
Whatever. What's interesting to me? Has anyone? Sometimes. Something I'm a philosopher by training, so I've had to learn in a hurry how to talk like someone who knows something about literature. And it's something that I've noticed is that frequently with great books, there are sequels made by other individuals or prequels.
Yeah.
Did anyone ever try to revisit The Grapes of Wrath? Or has anyone tried to update it for the modern times? Like, obviously, one of the major criticisms you can make about this text is it's dealing really just with the plight of white people. You could easily make this book about the migrants that are coming from Mexico today or then or whatever. Has anyone tried to repurpose this to take into consideration what it might be from the Hispanic perspective?
Well, that's an interesting idea. I am not aware of any version of that. of course, The Grapes of Wrath was the last of Steinbeck's, trilogy about migrant workers in the Depression, before he moved on to some other, topics. I mean, he thought his great book was East of Eden, which came, about 10 years later, and it's just a monumental novel, but a very bizarre story with nowhere near the impact and not at all the same social message. It's, 2 or 3 generations of very complicated family relationships that moves from Connecticut to California. It's partly based on Steinbeck's own family, and it has one of the most evil women in all of literature in it. And I'm kind of fascinated by where Steinbeck came up with the inspiration for.
Do you like the book East of Eden? Because
I'm
detecting some conflict in your voice.
I have some very mixed feelings about it, but it's clear that it's nowhere near as great a work as Grapes of Wrath. Anyway, so as far as the impact of the book, I mean, it really has been kind of telling its own story. I mean, there was some theatrical revival on Broadway, and I think in the '90s, and there was a PBS film that. So I think it is continued in its own voice as a work of literature without necessarily leading to much. I think it's been more inspirational in the musical front, starting with Woody Guthrie, because you have a lot of bands who have adapted material after reading it, or indirectly direct inspiration from Guthrie or Bruce Springsteen.
I feel you. Well, this has been a very productive conversation. We've had a lot to talk about here. I mean, do you want to say anything else about its reception, recognition, how it fits into Steinbeck's output and history of American literature? Maybe we could tie all those questions into the ending of our conversation here.
Well, we've kind of covered a lot of that already. It was a bestseller. It was controversial. It's considered, one of the great American novels of the 20th century. Sometimes literary scholars kind of poo-poo it as being a little bit too facile, to rank with the greatest writers. I mean, Faulkner is often considered to outrank Steinbeck in terms of the profundity of his message, but there are many people who would much rather read Steinbeck than Faulkner.
I've never heard you talk much about Faulkner. Are you a Faulkner fan?
No, I'm not really a Faulkner fan.
Really? We'll have to get, because I'm like kind of like, when are we going to talk Faulkner? When are we going to talk Faulkner? Because I feel like Faulkner would be a great challenge for me. So I'm kind of like, I want to sink my teeth into it.
Yeah. I've never gotten over the hurdle of the sort of impacted language, and I don't really find him appealing stylistically. I mean, I appreciate what he was trying to do, but as a storyteller, I'd much rather read Steinbeck. So,
is this your favorite Steinbeck offering, or do you think there are better ones in his catalog?
Oh, I definitely think it's far and away his masterpiece.
What are your 2 and 3? What's 2 and 3 for you?
I haven't, I found East of Eden fascinating, enthralling, but it's kind of like, hard to get through because it's so, it is so sprawling. I don't know. I have. It's been a while since I reread, some of his shorter works.
Cannery Row gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, Cannery Row is sort of a prose poem, and it's kind of a celebration of Ed Ricketts because the doc in that book is based on. So it's kind of a fun.
What about of Mice and Men?
Mice and Men, yeah, that's a
lot.
classic, of course, and I mean that's the other work in this so-called trilogy of In Dubious Battle, Mice and Men, and Grapes of Wrath. They were the sort of social novels of the migrant labor of the Central Valley. But I mean, there's some Steinbeck I haven't read, so I'm not by no means an authority on his complete works.
Well, I will have to say, I went into this conversation feeling pretty mixed up about the text, but now that you have illuminated so many of the underlying biblical patterns to the book, it makes me want to go back and read it again and with a better understanding. And I think I might. I think I might have to in order to really be at peace with the text. So this is a really invigorating conversation that really helped me a lot, and I hope it helps other individuals. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No. I mean, I think everyone who reads Grapes of Wrath in high school or might read it in college, I think they should really do some prep work and sort of prime themselves for following some of the biblical structures. And another interesting aspect there's one article on Pilgrim's Progress as an influence on the storyline. The journey of the family duplicating Christian's trip to the celestial city. It's quite a convincing article, and that's a whole other angle. Steinbeck read Pilgrim's Progress as a boy, and there's no doubt, I think, that also sort of influenced his story as a sort of allegory of the soul. And some of the characters could have been influenced by Bunyan's characters.
Off the top of your head, could you recommend any primer sources for anyone aside from this Bunyan article that you made reference to?
Well, the biblical angle is in a whole bunch of articles starting in the 60s. So if you go into JSTOR, this article database, you can find something. Also, a lot of books have chapters on the book on the Grapes of Wrath that key you into some of the biblical symbolism. I mean, it's a pretty broad literature that you can't really easily summarize, and it keeps on growing. In fact, because people have been writing about this since the 50s, and it's still going on. So
I would recommend to people, if they want quick studies on things to get a sense of who John Steinbeck was in the book, there's a lot of stuff that the BBC has put out, Melvin Bragg, and a few other individuals that you'll get up to speed real quick if you consume those. So you can find those on SoundCloud, the podcasting app, and YouTube.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend it. All right, man. Well, I thought it was a great episode. I want to thank you so much for just helping me understand these texts and our surrounding reality and world at large. So I hope everyone else has appreciated Dr. Jonathan Cook gracing us with his pedagogical skills. And please go and make accounts over at noetic.online so you can be part of that thriving community that we're going to build over there. We've got some very ambitious goals that we're going to meet for 2018. And Dr. Cook and I will talk for a second off air about what we do next. I have a feeling Upton Sinclair is coming soon.
Yeah.
and we'll be back with a new installment probably in, I don't know, probably about a month or so. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook.
Yeah. Thank you.